Hi, my name is Dylan Emerick-Brown, and I'm going to be teaching you about the first three chapters of Ulysses by James Joyce. I'm speaking here at the invitation of Professor Enrico Terrinoni, who's the Chair of English at the University for Foreigners of Perugia. This is for the English Literature course of Professor Terrinoni's Master Degree Program, Italian for Teaching to Foreigners. As I said, my name is Dylan Emerick-Brown. I teach English here at Deltona High School in Deltona, Florida. I'm speaking to you now from my house. I'm also the English Department Chair. As a Joyce Scholar, I've presented at the 26th Annual International James Joyce Symposium in Antwerp, also at the James Joyce Italian Foundation Conference in Rome. My work on Joyce has appeared in Language, Literature, and Interdisciplinary Studies, and forthcoming publications in the James Joyce Literary Supplement, Corpus, and Kairos. My most recent article is on teaching Joyce in secondary school and is in the latest issue of the James Joyce Quarterly. So you can find out much more about me and the work that I do at teachingjoyce.com, along with a lot of the notes that I'm going to go over with you now. So a little quick behind the scenes. I want this to be pretty informal, little discussion. I got some notes there, my daughter's toys in the background, some more notes here, cup of tea. So we're set to go. So this is going to be pretty much an informal sort of discussion about the first three chapters of my favorite novel, Ulysses. I'm even wearing the t-shirt of it. This is Ulysses in very small print, so you can get an idea there. I recommend reading the book, not my shirt. So the purpose of the following synopsis of your reading is designed hopefully to inspire you to delve into Ulysses and serve as a guide for what to look for. We could never focus on everything of importance in this immensely complex and beautifully written novel, but I want to highlight some of the aspects that make it my favorite novel. This shouldn't feel like a lecture so much as the beginning of a conversation. This is why I love Ulysses, and hopefully this will help motivate and guide you through the beginning of the novel. It is a novel based on real people with literary, religious, and historical allusions everywhere. After our brief synopsis of the beginning of the novel, I'll dive right into some key things to look for during your first read, and hopefully not last, reading of Ulysses. So the Telemachiad of Ulysses is comprised of the first three chapters, also known as episodes, of the novel. The Telemachiad is a reference to Telemachus, son of Odysseus, in Homer's classic epic, The Odyssey. Joyce used this epic poem as the scaffold of his novel set in a single day, June 16, 1904, now known as Bloomsday, in Dublin, Ireland. Ulysses, which is Latin for the name of Odysseus, brings back to earth the archetypal figures of Homer's work and recreates all of the human complexities, drama, and humor, but with the facade of realism. So, it's one of the things I absolutely love the most about Ulysses. It's because I could never really fully get into the Odyssey, which had these unrealistic expectations of people. And what Joyce does is he really pulls it back down to earth and gives it a fresh perspective in the modernist style, which he so eloquently pioneers. One of the many aspects of Joyce's genius was to harness the themes, allusions, and lessons of the Odyssey and tack them onto a believable, relatable, and empathetic collection of characters. The three main characters are Stephen Dedalus, first introduced in Joyce's previous novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, Leopold Bloom, and Molly Bloom. Leopold Bloom is an advertising canvasser who, though born in Ireland and converted to Catholicism twice, is seen by others as an immigrant and Jew, both true of his ancestors. Bloom is the Joycean avatar of Odysseus. His wife Molly is the Dublin Penelope of Homer's Odyssey and is preparing for an affair with a man named Hugh Blazes Boylan later that afternoon. Her infidelity is well known, and yet Bloom does nothing to stop it. They haven't had sex in a decade, ever since the death of their son, Rudy, who died after 11 days. Their daughter, Millie, is away in Mullingar working in a photo shop. And while the characters in Ulysses don't truly fit in with the characters in the Odyssey, there are parallels and thematic alignments which reveal them as true early 20th century versions of these archetypal figures. There's too much to go into for the time we have, so we'll leave it there and dive right into the first chapter. So Ulysses begins with episode 1, Telemachus, and picks up roughly a couple of years after Joyce's previous novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. A Portrait ends with young Stephen Dedalus, fed up with the social confines of Ireland, which stifles the creativity necessary for an artist to thrive, shipping off to Paris in self-imposed exile. Ulysses picks up shortly after his return to Dublin on a warm June morning. It is referred to as Telemachus because Stephen is representative of Odysseus' son. Just as Telemachus spends much of the Odyssey searching for his father, Stephen wanders through Dublin all day avoiding this and lamenting on society's perceived necessity of paternal role models. The setting is the Martello Tower, a round defensive fort constructed on the coast to protect the island from Napoleon decades earlier. It overlooks Dublin Bay and is the rented apartment of Stephen Dedalus, Buck Mulligan, and Haynes. Mulligan, a medical student, is a cocky and arrogant young man who portrays himself as Stephen's friend, but the friendship isn't completely sincere. Haynes is an Englishman collecting stories from Ireland for a book he's writing. Haynes suffers from night terrors and of a Black Panther, and the night before, he fires a shot at Stephen's head in the dark at the imaginary beast. Needless to say, this prompts Stephen to look for other lodgings throughout the day. Stephen, mocked by Mulligan for his formerly Catholic beliefs, is sensitive to the callous nature in which his friend talked about his mother, who had recently passed away. They have breakfast and head down to the water for a bath. Stephen, who has a fear of water, decides instead to go to work where he teaches at a nearby school. He leaves Mulligan the key to the tower and agrees to meet up later at a pub called The Ship. After all, it is payday. So, this is going to bring us right into episode 1, some initial notes. So this takes place between 8 and 9 a.m. And right out the gate, you get this mocking of Catholicism by Buck Mulligan, knowing that Stephen Dedalus grew up in Jesuit schools. So you have phrases like, a razor lay crossed. You have the Latin for, I will go to the altar of God, as he mocks the service. Mulligan even is written, it says, he peered down the dark, winding stairs and called up coarsely. So you've got this interesting use of alliteration, down the dark, called up coarsely, kind of highlighting the heaven above, hell below aspect. And he blessed gravely thrice the tower, the surrounding country, and the awaking mountains. Now, there's another interesting quote when it comes time for breakfast. He hacked through the fry on the dish and slapped it out on 3 plates, saying, In nomine Patri, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. The 3 eggs symbolize the Holy Trinity. Yellow and white are the colors of the Roman Catholic flag. Mulligan is the false father, Stephen is the son, and Haynes is the false Holy Spirit. While Joyce wrote Ulysses, Thomas Hardy published Panthera, poems about Jesus being the son of a Roman soldier named Panthera instead of being the son of God. Hence, the false Holy Spirit dreams of a Black Panther. So this all connects back to Haynes's nightmare, which became Stephen's nightmare. Interestingly, with Buck Mulligan, you have even puns on his name. He's based off of James Joyce's earlier friend Oliver St. John Gogarty from Dublin. There's an interesting quote in the beginning of the novel. He peered sideways up and gave a long, low whistle of call, then paused a while in rapt attention, his even white teeth glistening here and there with gold points. Chrysostomos. Two strong, shrill whistles answered through the calm. Now, Chrysostomos means golden mouth in Greek, and St. John Chrysostomos is a famed saint for his rhetorical skill, hence golden mouth. Buck Mulligan, whose full name is Malachi Roland St. John Mulligan, is based on St. John Gogarty. So you've got the pun with the golden mouth and also the gold teeth. You also have to understand that Buck Mulligan isn't who he really claims to be. He portrays himself as this arrogant, cocky, very intelligent medical student, but he makes common slips, such as says you have GPI, general paralysis of the insane. The correct medical term would be paresis, not paralysis. So he tries to portray himself as a little bit higher up on the food chain than he is in Dublin society. And then you get a lot of excellent senses of humor throughout this chapter. For instance, Buck Mulligan starts singing Coronation Day. Oh, won't we have a merry time on Coronation Day? It might seem confusing why this song is being sung, but Mulligan begins singing it thinking about Stephen getting paid that day so they can all go to the pub later for drinks. Stephen would be paid in crowns and sovereigns, hence the joke. You also get some very subtle mockeries of Homer's Odysseus and the Odyssey. In this case, the Iliad, which just prefaces the Odyssey. So the quote describing Mulligan is, equine in its length, and at the light untonsured hair, grained and hued like pale oak. So that's a description of Buck Mulligan, but it sounds a lot like the Trojan horse from the Iliad. Also, Buck Mulligan makes fun of Stephen Dedalus' last name, saying, your absurd name in ancient Greek. So you get a lot of this mockery of Homer's Odyssey, or homage, depending on how you look at it. There's also a lot of subtle hints at the English in Ireland, this colonialism that they were going through at this time. Remember, Ireland was not an independent nation at this time. So one of the questions Stephen asks Buck Mulligan in the morning is, how long is Haynes going to stay in this tower? Stephen's question regarding Haynes, the Englishman, living with Buck and himself, is symbolic of the Irish growing weary of the English's presence in Ireland. Also, when he points to a broken mirror, Stephen says, it is a symbol of Irish art, the cracked looking glass of a servant. So this famous phrase from Ulysses, which appears throughout, shows a sense of faultiness, reflection, and submissiveness, traits that he sees in the Irish people. You also get another very famous line from this chapter. It seems history is to blame. That's it. That's the way Haynes views the English's treatment of the Irish over centuries. It seems history is to blame. You'll see this pop up throughout the novel, so it's important to note where it comes from. It's not Irish, it's English. Now, about a year and 10 days ago, Stephen Dedalus' mother passed away. So he's dealing with a lot of guilt over the way that she passed. He even reflects on a dream that he had. Silently, in a dream, she had come to him after her death, her wasted body within its loose brown grave clothes, giving off an odor of wax and rosewood, her breath that had bent upon him, mute, reproachful, a faint odor of wetted ashes. So he isn't so much dreaming about his mother, so much as haunted by her. And that becomes clearer when you get the quote, you said, Stephen answered, oh, it's only Dedalus whose mother is beastly dead. That was what Buck Mulligan said when his mother asked who was at the door. It's only Dedalus whose mother is beastly dead. Naturally, Stephen takes this to heart and starts to question his friendship with Mulligan, which is probably the safe route. But when Mulligan tries to defend himself, he mentions, "You wouldn't kneel down to pray for your mother on her deathbed when she asked you." Now, this comment by Mulligan was the same rumor spread by Gogarty, who he based him off of, about Joyce over his mother's death. While Joyce and his brother Stanislaus refused to pray at their mother's bedside, the story was exaggerated. And then you get other little subtle quotes about how Stephen is feeling about his mother. Stephen, reflecting on his mother, says, "Her secrets, old feather fans, tasseled dance cards powdered with musk, a gaud of amber beads in her locked drawer, a birdcage hung in the sunny window of her house when she was a girl." So you get this sense of the past and being trapped in time, secrets, amber, locked, birdcage. So it's subtle, but Joyce does an amazing job of really setting this tone with the diction. Another very famous line you're going to get is "Agenbite of Inwit." Now, this is Middle English, so think Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which means remorse of conscience. It pops up throughout the entire novel. So whenever you hear "Agenbite of Inwit," it's a remorse of conscience. There's also the beginnings of Stephen's odd theory about Shakespeare. Stephen, the young artist, is trying to make a name for himself. So while doing so, he's trying to come up with poetry and things to write about, really solidify his artistic stance. And when Haynes asks about this, Mulligan mocks Stephen, saying, "He proves by algebra that Hamlet's grandson is Shakespeare's grandfather, and that he himself is the ghost of his own father. Japhet in search of a father, the son striving to be atoned with the father." Now, imagine a few ellipses there. I kind of jumped in quotes a bit, but you get this yearning for a connection between the son and father, which is reflective later of Leopold Bloom, who you first encounter in episode 4. And you also get this with Leopold Bloom's deceased son, Rudy, as well as Telemachus and Odysseus from the Odyssey. So this search for a father, whether it's Shakespeare and Hamlet and Hamlet's father's ghost, you get a lot of these father-son, even God and Jesus allusions throughout. It all connects back to Stephen. Then, as they go down to the water for a bath, there's an interesting, subtle line. Is this the day for your monthly wash, Kinch? The unclean bard makes a point of washing once a month. So Kinch is the nickname Mulligan affectionately gives Stephen, but it hints on something more powerful, Stephen's fear of water. Now this connects directly back to his time at Clongowes Wood College, which again, you get in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. However, ever since he was a boy, he's got a fear of water, so this will come up again and again. The quote itself we'll get to when we get to episode 3, so hang on to that. Now, as the chapter comes to a close, you get near the end, "I will not sleep here tonight. Home also I cannot go. Usurper." Now this is reflective of the Odyssey, in which Odysseus and Telemachus have been usurped in Ithaca by Penelope's suitors. Mulligan is the usurper here, and later Leopold Bloom will actually lock himself out of his own house, and the man who is going to be having sex with his wife, Boylan, will be usurping him as well. So, this brings us to some pictures here to kind of give you some context. You got the Martello Tower, where they live, and there's the beach. You can see where they had their little wash, and the chapter begins right up here, overlooking Dublin Bay at the top of the tower. So, that brings us to episode 2. Episode 2, also known as Nestor, begins in Stephen's classroom as he teaches his pupils about the Pyrrhic War of 279 BCE. The students try their best but struggle with the lesson as Stephen half-heartedly engages them with a riddle. This riddle has plagued scholars as much as it frustrates the students. The students are then dismissed outside to play while Stephen tutors a young boy named Sargent in math. He sees himself in the young boy and thinks again of his riddle. Mr. Deasy, the schoolmaster, comes to talk to Stephen, but asks him to wait in his office while he settles a dispute on the playing field with the boys. As it is payday, Mr. Deasy lectures young Stephen, who he doesn't believe is meant long for the teaching profession, on the value of money and paying his own way. Stephen tortuously sits through Deasy's lecture. Hopefully at this point, that's not you. Deasy then asks Stephen if he would be so kind as to bring an editorial he's writing on the recent cattle disease spreading through Ireland to the local newspaper for publication. He mumbles excerpts of it to himself as he writes. Stephen contemplates the horse races, his money troubles, and even God. As he leaves, Deasy makes an anti-Semitic joke about Ireland never letting the Jews into the country. And that brings us to Nestor, episode 2. Now this takes place between 9 and 10 a.m. in the morning. And you've got this wisdom of the old world and memory kind of woven into this chapter. It's a very short chapter, but there's a lot packed into it. So there's this wonderful quote, "Fabled by the daughters of memory, and yet it was in some way, if not as memory fabled it, a phrase then of impatience, thud of Blake's wings of excess. I hear the ruin of all space, shattered glass and toppling masonry, in time one livid final flame. What's left us then?" So, as Stephen teaches history, the Pyrrhic War, he considers the past, and the daughters of memory are the 9 muses, daughters of Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. So you get these subtle hints of the past. Now, I'm going to try and show you my view of Stephen's riddle, the one that plagues scholars, the one that plagues his students. Nobody knows for certain, so this is going to be my attempt to kind of take a stab at it and see what you think. All right, so here you've got the riddle. The cock crew, the sky was blue, the bells in heaven were striking 11. 'Tis time for this soul, poor soul, to go to heaven. And the answer to Stephen's riddle is the fox burying his grandmother under a holly bush. Now, there is a collection of old Irish riddles collected by Patrick Weston Joyce entitled English as We Speak It in Ireland from 1910, in which this is one. And you can see the original next to it here. Riddle me right, what did I see last night? The wind blew, the cock crew, the bells of heaven struck 11. 'Tis time for my poor soul to go to heaven. However, Joyce changes some of the words and phrases for his own purposes, such as in the answer mother in the original as opposed to grandmother. So we know Joyce knew of this riddle and altered it. The original has no clear meaning, as it is designed to be just a frustrating joke on whoever tries to solve it. Joyce's alterations suggest there's more to his version. So here you've got an interesting count of syllables, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6, 7. So you've got kind of a divide here between the first 4 lines and last 2. And if you notice, these first 4 lines are past tense, and then you get into present tense. So there's a conscious grammatical structure to Joyce's version of this riddle. And it makes sense because when you read it, these 2 lines at the end feel disjointed from the poem. Now, Rudy, Leopold Bloom's son, would have been 11 years old if he had lived. Dignam's funeral, which Leopold Bloom goes to in the beginning of the novel, is attended at 11 a.m., so heaven and 11 play in significantly to the poem here. Also, it is in Book 11 of the Odyssey that Odysseus travels to Hades, the realm of the dead. You'll also notice the letter T beginning a lot of these lines. Now, this might be a bit of a stretch, but bear with me for a while here. In Ogham, ancient Irish writing, the letter tin is T, and in medieval kennings means one of three parts of a wheel or weapon. So 6 out of 7 of the riddle's lines begin with T, and the odd one out has the word 11, the number of syllables in the last 2 disjointed lines. Coincidence? Maybe. And then you've got here fox, grandmother, hollybush. So remember, in medieval kennings, the tin means one of 3 parts of a wheel or weapon. All Ogham letters are associated with plants, and tin is associated with holly, which is one of the 3 nouns in consecutive alphabetical order in the answer. Now, Stephen refers to his mother in his own thoughts after revealing the answer to the riddle and says, "A poor soul gone to heaven, and on a heath beneath winking stars a fox, red reek of rapine in his fur, with merciless bright eyes scraped in the earth, listened, scraped up the earth, listened, scraped and scraped." Sitting at his side, Stephen solved out his problem. Now, foxes are also symbolic of cunning and wisdom, both traits Stephen sees in himself as a young man teaching his students. Also, Mr. Fox was the pseudonym of Charles Stewart Parnell, the Irish nationalist, and it's the one he gave himself when writing to his mistress, Kitty O'Shea. And so here we have a touch of sin, something Stephen is no stranger to, and something his very Catholic mother would be highly adverse to. Here is hopefully where it all starts to come together. So, fingers crossed. Up here. May, Stephen's mother was a devout Catholic and a grandmother, as opposed to grandmother. She was interred on June 26. Holly is strongly associated with Christianity, with its red berries symbolizing the blood of Christ and its thorny leaves symbolizing his crown. Now up here, if you can see, is a constellation. The fox is Stephen burying his mother, but also the Vulpecula constellation, the fox, commonly seen in the northern hemisphere at its strongest in June and July. So Stephen refers to his mother in his own thoughts after revealing the answer to the riddle and says, quote, "A poor soul gone to heaven, and on a heath beneath winking stars a fox, red reek of rapine in his fur, with merciless bright eyes scraped in the earth, listened, scraped up the earth, listened, scraped and scraped. Sitting at his side, Stephen solved out his problem." Now, rapine means the violent seizure of someone's property. This refers to the seizure of Stephen's family's property due to their financial state. The fox reeks because Stephen has a fear of water and rarely bathes, as we've established. So right over here, this last phrase, which starts the next paragraph, could refer to Stephen helping Sargent with his algebra, but it wasn't his problem. It was Sargent's problem. This phrase could allude to the solution, instead to his own subconscious riddle. So here you go. Stephen clearly felt guilt over his mother's death, much as Joyce did for his mother. Stephen sees Sargent struggling with his schoolwork as a younger version of himself and thinks about how coddling mothers can be toward their children. This all comes together in his distorted version of the old Irish riddle to reveal his subconscious guilt. Interestingly, in episode 15, the Circe episode, Stephen retells the riddle differently and drunkenly, but when attempting to explain it, he says, "Thirsty fox," he laughs loudly, "burying his grandmother, probably he killed her." Drunk Stephen is the thirsty fox, and so he is referring to Stephen. Stephen, much like Joyce, felt guilt that he was responsible for the death of his mother. As Stephen said in episode 15, quote, "They said I killed you, mother. Cancer did it, not I. Destiny." So hopefully that wasn't too in the weeds for you. But that's my interpretation, my humble interpretation of the riddle. But you see it come up again and again, and I think it's worth taking a stab at. That's one of the great fun parts of Ulysses. As Joyce had said, he put in so many riddles and enigmas it'll keep the professors, including Professor Terrinoni, busy for centuries to figure out what he meant by it. So have fun with the riddle. This also brings us to Stephen's views on money. He's not very good with it. So one of the quotes early on is, "Stephen's hand, free again, went back to the hollow shells, symbols too of beauty and of power. A lump in my pocket, symbols soiled by greed and misery." So while Stephen is sitting in Deasy's office, he's thinking about money and the troubles. Also, you get mulligan, 9 pounds, 3 pairs of socks, 1 pair of brogues, ties. Coran, 10 guineas. McCann, 1 guinea. Fred Ryan, 2 shillings. Temple, 2 lunches, and so on and so forth. So while Deasy is talking about money, Stephen is thinking in his head of all the people he owes money to, which really highlights just how poor with finances he really is. And the last sentence of this chapter is beautiful. I just want to throw it out there, and it does relate to money. "On his wise shoulders, through the checkerwork of leaves, the sun flung spangles, dancing coins." So imagining the light and the shadow play on the sidewalk like dancing coins. It's just a beautiful kind of thought. So you get a lot of puns throughout this chapter. You get parts that might seem confusing at times, such as when Deasy is mumbling to himself the letter that he's writing out, such as foot and mouth disease, known as Koch's preparation, serum and virus, percentage of salted horses, rinderpest, emperor's horses at Mersteg, Lower Austria, veterinary surgeons, and so forth. So when you get to those parts, you got to just remember this is Deasy kind of thinking out loud the letter that he's writing, and it helps the reader understand what he's talking about. And that brings us to Mr. Deasy's anti-Semitism. Now this is really going to tie in with Leopold Bloom, who everyone perceives as Jewish, but that's going to be in episode 4. We're focusing on the first 3 chapters. So at the end, Mr. Deasy is yelling to Stephen a joke. He says, "Ireland, they say, has the honor of being the only country which never persecuted the Jews. Did you know that? No? And do you know why? Because she never let them in." Now that's not true, but it starts to set up this sense of anti-Semitism people are going to feel for one of the other protagonists of the story. And likewise, you have Mr. Deasy commenting, "And that is why they are wanderers on the earth to this day." The wandering Jew, which Leopold Bloom, who wanders throughout Dublin that day, embodies. Now you also get a very famous line from Stephen, which is, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." Now this ties back in everything from what I told you at the beginning of this chapter. It all comes back to this sense of the old world, wisdom of the old world, history. You also get the quote, "The sea's ruler, his sea-cold eyes looked on the empty bay, history is to blame. There's Haynes again. On me and on my words, unhating. So again, you get Haynes's version of history. History is to blame, not the English. But even Stephen feels that it's a nightmare from which he's trying to awake. Another very famous line you're going to encounter throughout these many, many chapters. So keep those in mind as Stephen kind of contemplates his life and his place in the world. And this brings us to some pictures. So here you get an early 20th century schoolhouse, such as where you would have Stephen teaching the boys who outside play a game of cricket. There you go. There's Kitty O'Shea and Charles Stewart Parnell, the Irish nationalist, and his mistress. So it gives you a good sense of what's going on visually. Now, this is going to bring us to episode 3. Hopefully I haven't lost you guys yet. Now, episode 3 is known as Proteus, and it's all about change. Stephen walks along Sandy Mount Strand, a wide open beach, thinking about the world of his senses versus the world of his perception. It is a very philosophical chapter. During this episode, Stephen thinks about God, Christ, fathers in general, and what it would be like to take an alternative route and visit his mother's family nearby. However, he doesn't take that path and instead continues down the beach. Memories of Paris and thoughts of his present situation flood his brain. A dog runs along the beach, rekindling a fear of canines, and again he thinks of his earlier riddle with his students. He vows not to return to the Martello Tower, where he's afraid of being shot by Haynes in the night. Stephen thinks of a poem, and unable to find any paper, rips the corner off Daisy's letter and scribbles the draft on the scrap. He lays on a rock, further contemplating, then pisses, picks his nose, and walks on. So, that's going to bring us to the Proteus chapter. Now this takes place between 10 and 11 in the morning. One of the famous lines I love from early in this chapter is, "Shut your eyes and see." It's all about the literal vision versus the metaphorical vision. And it begins with ineluctable modality of the visible, the unavoidable existence of the visible. And remember, like Joyce, Stephen has poor eyesight, which was definitely more highlighted in a portrait, but this sense of the world he sees and interacts with versus the world as it really could be. And he even starts thinking of his old friend St. Thomas Aquinas from earlier in school. There's a nice quote from Stephen's daydream that reads, "His pace slackened. Here, am I going to Aunt Sarah's or not?" Stephen imagines what it would be like if he were to alter his path and head towards his Aunt Sarah's house. Simon, Stephen's father, did not think highly of his late wife's family. So you get this kind of mental crossing into this other path. What would it be like to go down this route, which he doesn't take? And that's a lot about what the chapter is delving into, the different paths we can take in life while Stephen is trying to find his. There's even a fun quote from Macbeth, if you like Shakespeare. The line reads, "They take me for a dun, peer out from a coign of vantage." Coign of vantage comes from Macbeth. This is a reference that suggests betrayal and deceit, as it's a comment made on Inverness, Macbeth's castle, when Duncan and his men arrive. No spoiler alerts, but it doesn't end well for him. You get also a lot of views of Stephen's perception of Ireland. At one point he says, "Unwholesome sandflats waited to suck his treading soles, breathing upward sewage breath, isle of dreadful thirst, a maze of dark cunning nets, a drying line with 2 crucified shirts, human shells." Now, these are all fragments of quotes from the same basic area, but you get this really strong sense of tone from these comments. Could souls, S-O-L-E-S, be a substitute for souls, S-O-U-L-S? Could the sewage breath be reminiscent of the breath of his dream mother? Remember, he quoted her saying, "Her breath that had bent upon him, mute, reproachful, a faint odor of wetted ashes." Could the Isle of Dreadful Thirst be a comment on alcoholism in the Irish? Could the maze of dark, cunning nets be symbolic of the complexity of Irish politics in a colonial nation? Who could the two crucified shirts represent? What makes us human shells? And what could fill us? So, as Stephen is going through these philosophical questions in this chapter, so are you. And that's one of the beautiful things about Ulysses. It's a very interactive book, and it changes you every time you read it. So this is basically Stephen's views in how he's seeing himself, his place in the world, and Ireland in general. You also get French every now and then. Whenever Stephen thinks in French, he's reminiscing back on his time in Paris before the novel takes place. You also get little hints of when he was in Paris, memories. There's a quote, "With mother's money order, 8 shillings, the banging door of the post office slammed in your face by the usher, hunger, toothache." While in Paris, Stephen's mother sent him money, and while in Paris, Stephen's mother fell deathly ill. So this further enhances his sense of guilt that she was dying while sending him what little money she had so he could go gallivanting in the City of Lights to find himself as a young artist. And then you get also the telegram that Stephen and James Joyce in real life received from his father. "Mother dying, come home, father." This is what pulls Stephen from the City of Lights in Paris back to Dublin. You also get a sense of alcoholism. Stephen has come a long, long way from the good altar boy that he was earlier in A Portrait of the Artist. There's a quote, "His breath hangs over our sauce-stained plates, the green fairy's fang thrusting between his lips." The green fairy is a euphemism for absinthe. And of course, "You're your father's son." There's a quote, "Just as Simon is an alcoholic, so has Stephen become one." So as Stephen tries to push away from his father Simon, some things are just inevitable. You also get a lot of sinking quotes. So this is something I always found very interesting. He's on the beach, and of course the feet will sink into the sand, but it's not always as literal as that. Here's one quote. "He stood suddenly, his feet beginning to sink slowly into the quaking soil. Turn back." So you get this sense of inevitability in Stephen's descent. And then there's another quote. "Turning, he scanned the shore south, his feet sinking again slowly in the new sockets. The cold domed room of the tower waits. Stephen fears Haynes as the night before he shot at a dream panther above Stephen's head with his pistol." This actually occurred, by the way, in Joyce's real life. And then you get another quote. "He lifted his feet up from the suck and turned back by the mole of boulders." Now this word, suck, is one that fascinated Stephen in A Portrait of the Artist as a young man. Then you get the language of waves. There's a quote, "These heavy sands are language tide, and wind have silted here." There's another quote. I'm going to try my best at it, so try not to laugh because you'll miss the wave speech, but here it is. Listen, a 4-worded wave speech. Now, it might sound like I just casted a spell on you or something, but that's Joyce's wave speech. He's trying to mimic the sound of the waves crashing and sliding onto the shore. I'm not going to say it again, but when you read it, picture it in your head And even though it's spelled kind of like gibberish, that's what he's going for. And it is kind of a beautiful attempt. And then you get this really nice quote that, for me, embodies the essence of Proteus, this overall theme of the chapter, change. Their blood is in me, their lusts my waves. I moved among them on the frozen Liffey, that I, a changeling, among the spluttering resin fires, I spoke to no one to me. Stephen imagines the Dane Vikings who originally founded Dublin, but you also get this beautiful sense of the ever-changing beach, through the wind, through the waves, and the world is ever-changing as well. You get more hints of Stephen's fear of water. He is on a beach, after all. There's a quote, "When I put my face into it in the basin at Clongowes, can't see. Who's behind me? Out quickly, quickly." Now, interestingly, we never get in a portrait this moment that we read in Ulysses. We never get the part where Stephen is washing his face and dunks his head into a water basin and gets terrified by someone behind him. But there is the reference, and it's very subtle there. That seems to be the genesis of Stephen's fear of water. You also get Buck Mulligan, who had saved a man from drowning, as Stephen thinks. He saved men from drowning, and you shake at a cur's yelping. And then there's a drowned man that people are waiting to fish out of the water in Ulysses throughout that day. You see the references pop up every now and then with the coroner and others, that someone had drowned and they're just waiting for the body to wash up. Stephen thinks about that in this chapter with this line. A drowning man, his human eyes scream to me out of horror of his death. I, with him together down, I could not save her. Waters, bitter death, lost. Stephen contemplates the increasing poverty of his sister, Dilly, and how he cannot save her without the risk of drowning himself. And who is the drowned man who appears throughout the novel? It kind of makes you think of Icarus, the son of Daedalus, Stephen's last name. It's a terrible picture in black and white, but there you go. You get references to Icarus, Lucifer from Paradise Lost falling, Telemachus, all of these boys, all of these figures who fall, who struggle, who trip. And that's what makes literature, for me, so wonderful, is not the successes so much as the failures, because that's what human is. And you see Stephen really fear this greatly, as we all do at one point or another. And he thinks about the drowning man, but is this Icarus? Is this Dilly, his sister? Is it himself? Is it all of us? You also get another reference to Stephen's riddle, which we covered. He says, something he buried there, his grandmother, as he watches a dog digging in the sand on the beach. And then, lastly, you start to get to this poem that Stephen thinks up. He has this inspiration on the beach, and he contemplates the poem. He comes, pale vampire, through storm his eyes, his bat sails bloodying the sea, mouth to her mouth's kiss. It leaves a lot wanting. It's not a great poem, but whenever you hear pale vampire, mouth to her mouth's kiss throughout the novel, it's going to be a reference to this poem Stephen contemplates on the beach. Now, as I told you earlier, he can't find any paper. Even in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, he never seems to have paper on him. He ends up scribbling on a cigarette carton, as I recall. But here, he's looking for something to write with. Paper. The banknotes, blast them. Old Deasy's letter, here. Thanking you for hospitality, tear the blank end off. Turning his back to the sun, he bent over far to a table of rock and scribbled words. So Stephen, lacking the paper to jot down his poem, ripped an end off Deasy's letter to use. This comes up again when Stephen hands the letter to the editor for publication. Quote, he stretched his arm wearily towards the foot of the bed, groping with his hand in the pockets of the coat that hung there. His fingers found a pencil and then a cigarette packet. There's the quote from A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I knew he was terrible with finding paper. Paper, money. Stephen definitely has to get his stuff together. And then you get some interesting references, which I'll leave you guys with because I can sense you're probably getting hungry or tired or bored or all three. There are little references where it's not clear if James Joyce is talking about Stephen or himself. I'll give you an example. One quote reads, "Who watches me here? Whoever, anywhere, will read these written words." Now this is Stephen contemplating his poem, but you can imagine Joyce wondering who's going to end up reading these words. Probably never imagined me or you. And then there's another quote, "You find my words dark. Darkness is in our souls. Do you not think? Flutier, our souls, shame-wounded by our sins, cling to us yet more, a woman to her lover clinging, the more, the more." So, I don't know about you. I don't necessarily find Joyce's words dark, but to each their own. Here are some pictures to help you kind of go with it. We've got cross trees, which come up later in the story. There's a reference that Joyce mentions with cross trees, and his friend, when he was writing Ulysses, Frank Budgeon, actually tries to correct good old Joyce, but Joyce corrects him, saying, no, the error is intentional, and it comes up later. But that's getting way too into the weeds for you guys. And then here is, of course, Sandymount Strand with people walking along. You can imagine it's a nice, wide open beach. So with that, I'll leave you. I really hope that you take to heart some of the things that we discussed or I discussed and you listened to, but really give Ulysses a shot. And it's filled with so much richness. Everyone who reads it takes something away that's different. And I really hope that you give it a chance and we can discuss this at another time. Professor Terrinoni has my email address, which I'm sure he's going to give to all of you. So feel free to email me. But also on Facebook, if you join the discussion group titled Teaching Joyce Discussion Group, makes sense, you'll also be able to post any questions. Hopefully you'll see my post, which will invite you to respond, and we can have a class dialogue, so to speak, on Facebook. Or, of course, you can just email me. And don't forget to check out teachingjoyce.com. Under Novels and Ulysses, I created a PowerPoint presentation for each of the 18 chapters of Ulysses to kind of help as a guide. And there's helpful links and resources. So I hope I haven't bored you guys too much. I hope you enjoy the reading, and I hope to hear from you soon. So thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and good luck.